Hey Mobilize, I'm super excited to be sitting here in the great city of Portland, Oregon. My name is Bo Noonan. I help serve the Confluence churches in the Northwest. And I also have the privilege of helping lead New Community Church in Tacoma, Washington. And I'm excited today because we're sitting here with John Mark Comer. John Mark, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for coming down.
Now, this is really great. We're in the heart of the city. And so you might hear some city sounds and things like that. But
rumor has it you got some heart coffee this morning?
I had my heart coffee.
Well done.
I'm shaking a little bit because it was so good. You know you're doing it right when you're trembling. So it's been great. We love this city. We love what Bridgetown's doing here. John Mark is the vision and teaching pastor here at Bridgetown Church. He's also the co-host of This Cultural Moment, which is a podcast about following Jesus in the post-Christian world. You've authored a few books. And we're really excited because you've got a new book coming out this week on the 29th called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, How to Stay Emotionally Healthy and Spiritually Alive in the Chaos of the Modern World. More on that book here in a minute. But John Mark, would love just to hear, how did you get to this point of leading Bridgetown, living here in the great city of Portland?
Yeah, I grew up on the West Coast, kind of born and raised. My dad was a first-generation follower of Jesus, came to faith in the Jesus movement out of a rock band, like the classic trope, right? And ended up as a pastor, so I grew up in that whole world. We moved up here as a family when I was a teenager, and then planted a church in my 20s. Wow. And so actually yesterday was my 16th anniversary of working at the church. So been here a little over a decade and a half, and right in the city, going for it.
What was that like? So you're in your 20s, your dad's leading a church, and you feel this sense to hey, I want to be involved in church leadership too. What was that call like?
Yeah, I mean, at some level, it was counterintuitive. You know, I remember saying when I was a teenager to God, I will do anything but pastor a church. And it wasn't like a rebellious moment. I have a great relationship with my parents, have been following Jesus as long as I can remember. So it wasn't like an anti-church thing. It was just more like, yeah, that's not for me. I want to go make money or do my stuff or whatever. But had a real kind of moment of call, actually at a retreat when I was 16, like this moment of kind of encounter with the Spirit of God. And, you know, in language, basically felt that God said, that thing you said never, that's the one thing, you know? So I had been on a trajectory toward that for a number of years. Of course, you never know. Calling starts out so vague and ambiguous, and you don't know exactly what it will actually look like and feel like, or when, or the timing. In our instant gratification culture, we expect clarity right away and then opportunity right away, and normally both of those follow many years down the road. So it's been kind of a long, slow progression that I'm still in as I near 40 of figuring out exactly who I am and who I'm not, what I'm made for, what I'm not made for. You know, I feel more comfortable in my own skin than I ever have. But it's been a 2-decade journey. I'm
realizing for myself, just tipping over 40, that God was doing way more in me and taking on leadership responsibility in my 20s than He was doing through me. And I know a little bit about your journey, so God's been doing a lot in you.
And I mean, I would say to that, I came up in a church culture that, without sounding cynical or critical, I don't mean it that way, I think did not say enough against ambition in the negative sense. And it's so funny, depending on the city that you came up in or the socioeconomic world that you grew up in, ambition is kind of on a scale. So there's, if you think of it through the Greek virtue lens of, too much or too little. Too much of ambition and you have just the world that we live in and so much of the power dynamics. Too little, and you have people that are stunted or don't grow or don't move out into their God-given potential. And so I was always, I think, more on the too ambitious side. And so much of my early years of leadership was driven, workaholic, ambition, wanted to make a name for myself, which is, I think, part of the reason I got involved so young, So a lot of the last 20 years has been God working that out of me. And again, some people need to actually step more into drive, ambition, call, work. Other people need to throttle off. For me, it was the latter.
And so you started a college ministry out of the church you and your dad were planning. And that kind of took off.
I mean, it was a different cultural moment. It was, 16 years ago. This was in the suburbs. I'm now in the city. So 16, 17 years ago in the suburbs, it's just a very different cultural moment, and our city's church ecosystem, there's been a wave of church planting since. We were at the kind of the second or third kind of church plant in, and there's a number now that are thriving, but there was almost nothing. So there were some churches that had grown older, you know, and were solid and faithful to Jesus, but were really not doing a great job of passing the baton to the next generation. And so much, as we know, has changed culturally. It's a very different world than it was 30, 40 years ago when a lot of these churches were planted. So, I think it struck a chord, you know what I mean? We started a college group of 6 people in my parents' living room, and eventually it became, a couple thousand kind of thing.
Yeah. And you were doing like kind of rowdy worship and...
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm dating myself. This was 16, 17 years ago. If you did like rock and roll worship and lit candles, like you were on the cutting edge. Like now we laugh, and so who cares? And who cares anymore?
Yeah, but
at the time it was a thing.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, and a big impact I'm sure on many lives.
Yeah, and my heart has always been. I think I would say this before I ever read Dallas Willard or anybody like that. I used to say, I want to help Christians become disciples of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that's always been my kind of heart, my sense of call. And so I grew up in the church, grew up in kind of mega church culture, and there were a number of kind of teenagers and 20-somethings that were in our greater Portland area at the time that either had no church experience or had come up in the church but had never really said yes to follow after Jesus. Yeah. So it was kind of like a real moment of kind of call.
Yeah, so you mentioned Dallas Willard, who I can't recommend enough to the Mobilize generation. Get a hold of his stuff and his teachings, and because one of the things that you've done is you've really started to invite people using the language to apprentice to Jesus.
Yeah.
So talk about that. Like, how did you get to use that language? What's the difference between that, if there is any, becoming a disciple of Jesus or apprentice of Jesus? Yeah,
no, that's great. We intentionally use the word apprentice instead of the word disciple, and that's just the Greek word in the New Testament is mathetes, and disciple is just a fine translation. The problem with that is we don't use disciple in modern English vernacular. So what happens is people import meanings into it. For example, when most people talk about discipleship in the North American church, it has nothing to do with first century Jewish context. Most people don't even realize that discipleship was a part of the Jewish education system, where you would apprentice under a rabbi, you'd follow it. Not just Jesus was not the only one to have disciples. Even in the 4 Gospels, John the Baptist has disciples. And so it's very common. A rabbi would take on a few apprentices. They would travel around with him from village to village, spend time with him, sit under his teaching, attempt to copy, imitate, mimic his life. And then it was basically, it wasn't certified as we think of education today, but it was how you became a rabbi for the most part. You would apprentice under one with the end goal that you wanted to do what he did eventually.
Yeah, right.
So, and it didn't even start in Israel. It started back in Greece. Like Plato was a mathetes, or a disciple of Socrates. So it's a common part of the first century world, but because we've torn it out of that context, most people think of it as something else. For example, most people use disciple as a verb, not as a noun. Like, who are you discipling? Is anybody discipling you? Which is a little odd because it's never used as a verb in the New Testament. It's only used as a noun. If you put a synonym in, it doesn't work. Like, nobody asks me, like, who are you Christianing?
Yeah, well.
Or, Bo, are you believering anybody? Or has anybody ever followered you? You're like, wait. Follow, like on Instagram, or it doesn't even make grammatical sense because but in that paradigm, discipleship becomes something that is done to you. So when most people think about discipleship, they think about either leadership development, which is that Jesus had 12, every leader should have a small group, which is great, but what that fails to recognize is that Jesus had many more disciples. The 12 were a subset of the apostles, but Jesus had hundreds, if not thousands, of disciples who would follow him. And then other people think of it as like one-on-one mentorship. Like, I'm a 16-year-old, Bo, would you disciple me?
Right.
And they want to sit down with you once a week, and you go through a book together, read Dallas Willard, or listen to podcasts. Which is, again, I think those are both wonderful things, but very careful to call that leadership development and mentorship or accountability, not discipleship. So a number of English scholars, this is not me, I'm not a lexicographer, but argue that apprentice is really the best word we have in English to translate it, because a disciple or a follower of Jesus was an apprentice who would basically follow Jesus, spend time with him, sit under his teaching, attempt to copy, imitate, become like him, with the end goal that we eventually do the kinds of things that he did.
Yeah. So you've grown up in seeing some megachurch.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at like the product of discipleship that's coming out of that world,
or lack of product, or lack of discipleship.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of the kind of disgruntled Christians now who are,
Yeah.
whether it's disappointment with church leaders or just
Or they just don't feel transformed.
Yeah.
They read Jesus and he has this offer of full life transformation and healing of the soul, and like, I've been at church for 20 years and
Yeah.
I just feel older.
So
You know?
using the word apprentice, that built into that word, you're saying you're going to actually be trained to do what Jesus did.
To follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think, Willard said so many interesting things. One, he said the greatest need in our world today with all of its challenges is for those who identify as Christians to become disciples of Jesus.
Wow.
And we have this word, Christian's not, as you know, not really a word used in
Right.
the New Testament. It's used 2 or 3 times as a pejorative. So in the New Testament, in the 4 Gospels, you have this literary device by pretty much all 4 authors of 2 groups of people, the disciples and the crowd. And the crowd is a mixed bag. They're not all evil. There's evil people in the crowd, like the Pharisees who plot to murder Jesus. There's good people there. There's people that just don't know Jesus. It's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And the 4 Gospel writers, I think, want us, when we read the stories of Jesus, to, like, in this binary either-or thing we hate, to kind of identify as one or the other.
Right.
In America, or at least in the Western world, we've kind of created this 3rd category of Christian, where we kind of, in the mental furniture of our mind, like, arrange it to make space for God and the basic doctrines of Christianity.
Yeah.
Come to church a little bit, might be once or twice a month, might
Yep.
be once or twice a year,
Right.
and, like, kind of sort of live by the Judeo-Christian ethic, but not fully, not about violence or sex or whatever, but kind of,
And sadly, even kind of identify with a political
right or left,
Right.
and then that's usually filtered through the right or the left in our country.
Right.
Neither of which represent, Jesus' kingdom very well. So I think there's a lot of people that believe in God and are good people, not bad people, but don't understand that you can be a Christian but not a follower of Jesus. And I just think Jesus doesn't have that category. You're in the crowds and you're welcome. That doesn't mean you're burning in hell or under God's wrath. It just means you're there. I don't know where you're at with God.
Yeah.
But then to follow Jesus is literally to apprentice under him. We define it by 3 goals: be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what he did.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to help people understand that disciple is not something that's done to you. It's not a program. It's not a mentor. It's who you are if you follow Jesus. And it's a life of apprenticeship where you are literally attempting to become like Jesus and live the way that he would live if he were in your body.
Yeah. I mean, one of the goals that I saw of me growing up in church was people tried to disciple you into the church.
Yeah.
So the ultimate was that you served.
Yeah.
And you gave.
Or disciple you to evangelism.
Right. And so broadening that out to apprentice, so that changes your work life.
Yeah.
Changes your family life, changes
Whole
your
life.
friendship life. Like
Everything.
Yeah. So maybe speak to that just a little bit about terms of like following Jesus outside of the church community and into your world. What does that look like? How are you training people at Bridgetown to do that?
Well, I mean, first, I just love that you're asking that question. I think that's, the compartmentalized kind, which is how the Western world works. But there's no like hermetically sealed box that you put your life with God in. You know what I mean? It's supposed to pervade everything.
Yeah.
When it doesn't, something is broken. So of that 3rd goal, be with Jesus, become like Jesus, do what he did. A better phrase for that, I think, it's a bit of a mouthful. It's just do what he would do if he were you. Because the tricky thing about following Jesus is none of us are a 1st century celibate Jewish rabbi. So how do you, copy Jesus' life if you're a 19-year-old girl who's a university student or a barista, or if you're a young parent, or if you're a 40-something pastor on the West Coast of America.
Early 40s.
Yeah, 40-something, like 40-ish or whatever, a young 40.
Just tipped up.
Sorry to expose you. Or whatever, a software designer, or whoever you are. Like, how would Jesus do this? And sometimes it's just beginning with that question. How would Jesus do my work? First you have to have biblical theology of work, which goes back to Genesis, Eden, raw materials, rule over the earth, create culture. Then you have to have a biblical theology of sin and recognize that some work does not qualify as God-blessed work. And much work in the modern world would come under, I think, God's critique more than his blessing. Yeah. So you have to ask, okay, is this something that Jesus would do? Is this something I can do in a way that would honor God, that is open for blessing? And unfortunately, I think not enough Christians think through work with that lens, And then once you get there, all right, how would Jesus do this? How would he live in corporate America with all of its stuff? How would he be a barista? How would he raise children? How would he, And so, yeah, I think it's attempting to take discipleship to Jesus and a life that is motivated by love. Because in a biblical theology, work is an expression of love for God and for neighbor.
Yeah.
And then apply that to literally every arena of your life.
Yeah. So just before we kind of move on from that, just to slow it down real quick, and just capture it again, the three things you're teaching people, not just in their church life, the three things about apprenticeship to Jesus that you're teaching that we rearrange our whole life around those three things. Give them to them one more time slowly.
Just for us, to apprentice under Jesus is to organize your entire life around three very simple goals: to be with Jesus, to become like him, and to do what he would do if he were you.
That's great.
And we do that, of course, together in community. Right. You
know, help them understand this cultural moment. Help them to understand the traps and the pitfalls of the world we live in here in the U.S. in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think about this moment as like the perfect storm of about four kind of convergence streams, which I would say are post-Christian secular culture, the phone, and all the hurry and distraction and addiction that's come with it. Then the first adult generation that's the byproduct of widespread divorce. And then fourth, the first adult generation that's the byproduct of a mega church mentality. And these four things have created a really like hornet's nest.
Yeah.
You know, you have the secular post-Christian narrative that has been around since the Enlightenment, but was kind of trapped in elites, you know, on university campuses where much fewer people were educated at university, or was kind of truncated in the urban core of cities. But now with the rise of postmodernism, with the rise of education, more people going to college, and then with the phone and the digital internet thing, you no longer have to live in downtown Portland or New York or San Francisco or LA to live in the secular post-Christian narrative. All you have to do is have internet access or a newspaper, you know. And, you know, Philip Reif, who's a sociologist, not a Christian, but very warm toward the way of Jesus, Jewish sociologist, uses this framework of pre-Christian culture, Christian culture, post-Christian culture. So pre-Christian culture is like, you know, a culture before the gospel comes to it. So it's ancient, you know, Celtic Ireland or the Roman Empire or Africa before the gospel. Christian culture is misleading. There's no such thing as Christian culture, but Christianized or Christendom. That's always a mix of like Christian, Judeo-Christian ethics, value, worldview with pagan or now secular ideas. And then post-Christian culture is a Portland, Oregon or a Tacoma or whatever, which is living as a reaction against Christian culture. And it's attempting to hold on to some of the key tenets, things that we just take for granted. They're all Christian ideas: equality, justice, love, tolerance even, you know, but wanting to move kind of beyond it and kind of de-spiritualize it. So my buddy Mark Sayers likes to say they want the kingdom but without the king, you know.
Wow.
So what my friend Mark and many others have pointed out is that if you're coming from a Christian culture to a pre-Christian culture, so say you're a missionary from London in 1872 to what we now call, you know, Zimbabwe or whatever, then the danger is that you colonize the culture. You bring not just the good news of Jesus, you bring whiteness with you, you bring Europeanness with you.
Khaki pants and a
exactly.
white shirt.
So you go to Africa now, and there'll be some beautiful indigenous churches that just so like fills your heart with joy. And you'll walk into some churches and everybody's wearing a suit and tie, like on the equator, sweltering heat, singing hymns in English written by dead white guys from 150 years ago. And you're like, I mean, okay, but we're not in London. You know what I mean? This is colonization mixed in with the good of the gospel. But what they have pointed out is that if you're coming from a Christian culture to a post-Christian culture, say you grew up in the church and you moved to downtown Portland, you know, or you go to a Christian university and then you like move to New York or wherever, or you just have internet access at this point, then the danger is the opposite. It's not that you colonize, it's that you're colonized.
Right.
There's no danger that all of a sudden Portland's going to all start singing Hillsong too much or whatever, or Bethel's going to just... That's not a threat. I don't have to worry about colonizing my city. What I have to worry about as a follower of Jesus here is in what ways has Portland and the secular post-Christian narrative colonized me and like contorted the narratives in my mind that I live into reality by, you know? So secularism is just so corrosive. I mean, it literally aims evolutionary theory, and I think there's very much a place for a biblical theology of evolution, but evolutionary theory that's naturalistic, meaning this whole thing is an accident, just a glorious accident, time and chance, God has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
I mean, that cuts at the very core of worldview. I mean, the difference between I'm an animal with time and chance on my side, who's become the dominant species on the planet, it's a radically different worldview than I'm an image bearer of God, made by a good, wise, all-knowing, all-loving creator with a destiny in God's great world, and I can trust him for the future of it. You know, I mean, we're talking about radically different worldviews, and it's just the naturalistic, secular, kind of reactionary against Jesus worldview is so corrosive, and it is the air we breathe. You know.
Yeah.
So that's the first one, I think, that we're living in.
And that makes its way into church, which
100%.
is probably perhaps where you're going with the megachurch thing. The result of kind of when I was a kid, the big warning to us Christian kids was be careful of the humanist manifesto. That life is human-centered, not God-centered. And so, but it feels like a lot of what gets preached in church now is, you know, like you be you and be the best you. And
again, that's colonization. You know.
Yeah.
And some of it is the mentality around, you know, so mega church. There's two different ways that people use that word. One is for a certain size church, which is like, you know, more than 2,000 people. And I'm less angsty about that. The other is for a way of doing church. That as a general rule is personality-centric, is Sunday-based, and, you know, kind of consumer-oriented programming. I forget who first came up with that trifecta. Meaning it's kind of about a personality, preacher, worship leader, whatever. Church is about Sunday. So tell me about your church, they tell you about the people, the leader, and the Sunday. And then consumer-oriented programming, which would sound like Young Moms Club and, you know, not bad things, but kind of like attracts like, you know. And the thing about that mentality of church has pervaded the Western church. There's a lot of 100-person mega churches, meaning you walk in and they're just not as successful by those metrics, but it's still personality-centric, Sunday-centric, and consumer-oriented programming, you know? And I think that the trick, the temptation there, and especially many of them, you know, have leaders who are evangelists, which I have much respect for. Like, what they really care about is seeing people come into the kingdom.
Great point.
And their sweet spot is not helping those people then grow into Christ-likeness. And I have a lot of respect for them, so I don't want to criticize that. But I think the temptation on an evangelist, every type of leader has their own temptation. I definitely think one of the temptations for that mentality of church is the end justifies the means. And so is to kind of lose some of the integrity of what this thing is in order to, quote, reach people. And I just think, man, you can't, that's not a sustainable methodology. So I think what's happened is, you know, it goes back farther than the megachurch. It goes back to really the Second Great Awakening and the way that American revivalism kind of introduced this idea of the altar call and the evangelical emphasis on personal conversion, which I think I agree with at a theological level, biblical level, but some of the practical level I take some issues with. And so in evangelicalism, you know, really saving souls as defined by that kind of post-Reformation believe in Jesus and go to heaven when you die thing, which obviously we know it's more than that, but that's how it gets truncated a lot, became such the emphasis of the whole church that discipleship got lost, community got lost, you know, and it was more of a Christianized culture, so they didn't have to do the level of worldview interaction that I think we're needing to do now.
Yeah, which is a great point. Yeah, because oftentimes in past generations, praying a prayer at summer camp, you then kind of leaned into a Christian culture.
Yeah, I mean, D.L. Moody has said some great things about that. I mean, if you look at most of the evangelists, even up to Billy Graham, most of what they were doing was calling people to act on what they already believed. You know what I mean? So most of these people were already believed in God, and many of them, depending on how far back you go, already believed in the Bible. You were just really calling people to basically repent and live into what was, you know. Now, I mean, we're dealing with a whole generation that doesn't even believe there is a God and thinks we're an animal, an evolutionary thing, and thinks actually the Bible's teachings are unethical or immoral around women or sexuality or transgenderism, whatever. And so, I mean, you just have to go so far. And Moody saw this many years ago. He said, well, is it eventually people have to go back and start in the beginning?
So there's a cost now that's seen right up front, that you're going to count the cost. That you don't sign up for church because it's a social club anymore.
Oh yeah, that moment's
not
over.
in Portland, not in Tacoma.
Yeah, because the cultural pressure is not toward church; it's toward brunch.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Okay, so you got I think you mentioned 4.
Yeah. So post-Christian culture.
Mm-hmm.
First adult generation that's the byproduct of divorce. First adult generation that's the byproduct of the megachurch. First adult generation that's the byproduct of widespread divorce.
Yeah.
And this is the one that gets less mentioned, but in my experience as a pastor, has been catastrophic. So if you know anything about attachment theory, which is connected to the divorce rate, and how those that identify as secure attachment, if you know anything about that, is way down over the last few decades.
So I know everything about that, but no, I'm just kidding. The listeners
Yeah.
here, just maybe unpack it just a little bit
Well,
of
we don't even know the whole thing.
attachment
Yeah,
theory.
so it's kind of an ancient idea that was redone in the 1970s by a psychologist named John Bowlby, who basically identified that the way that we interact with our primary caregivers, our parents, as little babies, before we even know how to talk, there's a part of the brain that's the attachment system that's literally wired to attach to other people, including God, to relate to other people. And this part of us is set by how we relate to our primary caregivers in the earliest years of our life. Okay. He identified basically 4 different attachment styles or patterns, only one of which is healthy, what he called secure attachment. It was anxious, where people learn they can't trust themselves, and so they have unhealthy coping mechanisms in relationship. There's avoidant, where people learn they can't trust others, and by I say learn, all of this is subconscious. Yeah. Learn they can't trust others, so when they get near an intimacy with somebody, they just wall off, or they ghost them, or they kind of disappear, and the intimacy scares them. Yeah. And then there's one that's kind of a mixture. And what you don't hear in the news, which is fascinating because there's so much data behind it, is that those that identify as secure attachment, which is basically, I think the world's a good and mostly safe place, and I can trust most people, and I can mostly trust myself. Just kind of basic, healthy, not perfect family, just basic, healthy upbringing. That is way down, basically, to, as divorce has gone up, attachment, those that identify as secure attachment has gone way down. And there are massive implications for our discipleship to Jesus, because at a spiritual level and just a neurobiological level, there's a little book on this I love called The Relational Soul. And their little line is, how you relate is how you relate. Meaning the way that you learn to relate through your family of origin and your upbringing shapes the way that you relate not only to other adults as you age, but to God himself. Wow. So it's a total fallacy, and when we say it, we know it's not true, but to think that you can have a massive father wound and not trust men and think that doesn't affect your prayer life with the God that Jesus called Father. Right. Or have your mom abandon you when you were 9 and have a massive trust issues and have that not affect your capacity to release your entire life and trust into God's hands and his nurturing care. Yeah. So we're dealing basically with the emotional fallout of Woodstock at an adult now generation. I mean, the number of people in my church, 64% of my church comes from a divorced home. Wow. And I have lots of compassion. I understand life is painful. Yeah. But the number of people in our church that are upwardly mobile, well-educated, are killing it at their jobs, and have massive inhibitions around trust, relationship, commitment, sexuality, marriage, is just stunning. Wow. You know? So it's a massive discipleship issue is all I'm saying. And it really affects our relationship to God and our relationship in community. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. It's really helpful.
Yeah.
And something actually.
The good news, that sounds harbinger of doom. The good news is an unhealthy attachment pattern can be healed, but it can only be healed through loving relationship. So it can't be healed by reading a book or listening to a podcast. Right. There's no pill for it. There's no killer app for it. You basically heal. So if you've been wounded by a father or a mother, you heal by being in loving relationship with a good man or a good woman. Yeah. And that's where the Church of Jesus is, I think, designed by Jesus to be this place of healing of the relational soul. Wow. You know?
Yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah.
Was that all 4 of them?
That was 3 of the 4. Okay. So sorry, that's like we're going into lecture mode here. So yeah, post-Christian culture, first adult generation is the byproduct of widespread divorce, Woodstock. First adult generation is the byproduct of kind of a mega-church mentality across sizes of church. And then the 4th one, I would just, I'd either call it hurry or just digital distraction. Yeah, those 2 things are, you know, I mean, 2007, the year that Jobs released the iPhone into the wild, changed the world. You know, most of you watching I'm guessing, are younger, and so if you're a digital native, you don't have a before and after. I'm just at that age where I have a before and after.
Yeah, me too.
You know, I remember the late 90s, we used to call it boredom. It was this thing I have yet to experience in a decade, you know? But where you'd come to a stoplight and you just sit there.
Yeah.
You wouldn't text, you wouldn't check the weather, you wouldn't pull up a podcast, you'd just wait.
There were these things on TV called commercials.
Oh, they were the worst.
And you would just sit through them.
Terrible. And you just or mute it if you were into it.
Yeah.
Or you'd be on a plane flying across the country and you'd finish your book early and you'd be over Minnesota and you'd just stare at snow. You know what I mean? There's nothing to do, you know?
Yep.
And I don't want to glorify something as inane as boredom. No desire to go back to that. But those little moments were such gifts because they were potential portals to God. So little moments just to come back to God in our mind and our heart and our body. Yeah. Now all of those moments are gone, just totally swallowed up by the digital carnivore, you know? And what the phone has done, the way that it's put the world's narratives in it, the way that the entire kind of marketing system is based around addiction and distraction. So the economists call it the attention economy. We want to believe that when we go on Instagram or whatever, that we're the customer. We are not the customer. We are the product. So Instagram, Facebook, they make billions of dollars by harvesting our data and stealing our attention. So we're not how they make money. They make money from other companies that market to us and use our data to better market to us, to manipulate us when we're emotionally most vulnerable. So every time we go on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, we are the product and we submit ourselves to a multi-billion-dollar, multinational industry that is, I'm not saying they're all evil people, I'm sure there are many good people in it, but is intentionally attempting to distract us and addict us to that distraction, to take our attention because they can monetize it. Now that might be a very Orwellian way to think about it, but I'd rather err on that side,
Well, but people do ask, is Big Brother listening? Because 1 minute you're having a conversation about something, the next minute Google is popping an ad.
Oh, I mean, I started reading 1984 for the first time right now. I read it last night. And first off, it's bizarre that people apply that to the right. It's far more applicable to apply that to the left, unless if I'm missing something. Yeah. But it's bizarre how prescient it is. You're oh my gosh, a device that is watching you and always listening to you. That's my phone, you know? Yeah. Oh my gosh, and Russia or whatever. So, and I think the reason it matters, is because you have to recognize that every time you pick up your phone, you're picking up a weapon, a dangerous tool. I mean, there was a fascinating study out of I want to say the University of Virginia. I don't have footnotes for this conversation, so I'd have to go research to make sure I'm right. On just as long as we're talking about touchy subjects, on aggression in men and women. And it basically said, the summary of the study was basically said that it's a myth that men are more aggressive than women. It's the common perception, it's not true. That the truth is, gender stereotypes at some point hold true, and as a general rule, men and women display aggression differently. Men tend to display it more through force or even physical force or violence. Women tend to show aggression, I forget the exact language they use, but through creating boundaries, who's in, who's out, subtle, more men are more aggressive, more passive aggressive. That's, again, stereotype, these are just, large statistical kind of budgets. And what they said was that that's interesting, this is a secular study done by a progressive kind of crew. At the end they concluded if you wanted to destroy an entire generation of adolescent men, you'd put a gun in their front right pocket. If you wanted to destroy an entire generation of adolescent women, you'd put a smartphone with Instagram in their front right pocket. Oh, wow. This is not a Christian thing, this is not a conservative thing, this was a progressive secular university doing this. I thought that was really compelling. There's a danger. If we all had guns in our purses and pockets, we would be very, whoa, we'd be very careful or whatever. And I don't think we realize the threat that the phone is to our emotional health and our spiritual life. And what it's doing to corrode, even if we're thoroughly orthodox in our theology, what it's doing to actually corrode our experience of God and His joy.
Oh, yeah. Know? So you got this book coming out. This week.
I do.
The ruthless elimination of hurry. So talk about that. How are you teaching that? How are you living that, actually, first off? And then how are you teaching that to the 20s in your church?
Yeah, I mean, the book kind of comes out of a little bit of my autobiography. About 5 years ago, I was leading a mega church that college group had grown into. And by external metrics, everything was going really well. But by internal metrics, I was dying. At an emotional level, I was just burned out. super anxious, tired all the time, stressed, on edge. Relational level, I was just agitated a lot. I was not kind, I was not compassionate, I was not present, did not have time for the people closest to me. At a spiritual level, like I was just too busy to be with God. And I woke up and read my Bible and prayed every single morning. Like I grew up in that, was mentored into that. That's in my muscle memory. Like I will begin my day with quiet time. But still, that was no longer cutting it against the digital kind of hurry, onslaught, overload, you know?
Yeah.
So long story short, I kind of stepped down from leading this larger church, and I went on a sabbatical, and I went on a deep dive into spiritual formation and emotional health and Sabbath and therapy and prayer and like all this stuff. It's been life-changing. And as part of it, I came across this story. So John Ortberg, who's a pastor down in Menlo Park that I really look up and respect, and he graciously lets me have lunch with him once in a while. And I wouldn't call him a mentor. We're not at that level yet. But we have lunch on a quasi-regular basis, maybe once or twice a year. And he himself was mentored by Dallas Willard for 20 years. And Dallas Willard, philosopher, teacher of the way of Jesus, nobody's had a greater impact on my kind of view of what it means to follow Jesus outside the New Testament than Willard has. And he's just a gift. I think he's a gift. And anyway, I was asking him stories or whatever, and John tells this great story from the late 90s, actually, pre-phone, when he called up Willard, and John was on staff at this huge, very well-known church at the time, was kind of a best-selling author, but just felt that something was kind of off. He was stuck, you know, and was getting sucked into just the kind of overload of life. And so he calls up Willard out in California and says, all right, what do I need to do, however he said it. And he said that there was a long silence on the other end of the line, because with Willard, Willard was famous for being incredibly unhurried and slow. And then Willard said, hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day.
Wow.
You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life.
Wow.
And that's all I said. John wrote that down and said, great, what else do I need to know?
Yeah.
What else is there? And then apparently there's another long silence. And then Willard said, there is nothing else.
Wow.
You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry. And so when I first heard that story from John, and he's since put it in a book or two, it's, first off, it just struck a really deep chord in my life.
Yeah.
Secondly, it was really weird, like the greatest challenge, you know, the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. I live in one of the most secular, progressive cities in the world. Like we have a naked bike ride that people come here for. Like it's crazy, far left, secular, atheistic, you know? And if you had asked me prior to that, what's the greatest challenge to following Jesus in the city? I don't know what I would have said, but I don't know that hurry would have even made the top 10.
Wow, yeah.
But the more I think about it, the more it becomes it's in spot one. It is literally the thing underneath so many of the other things.
Yeah.
It's the root underneath so many of the symptoms of emotional and spiritual toxicity, you know?
Yeah.
So basically the last 4 or 5 years, I've really taken that, not just to heart, but attempted to take that into my body.
Okay.
And really been trying and training to slow my life down.
Yeah.
And man, is it hard, and the most difficult thing I've ever done with Jesus.
Yeah.
And I have 3 kids, I live right in the city, I'm leading a church, I
Yeah.
write books, blah, blah, blah. But it has also been, I think, one of the most invigorating, life-giving, life-changing things that I've ever said yes to with Jesus.
All right, so as you look at the landscape of culture and the church, and you look at this generation coming through, we know there's pitfalls, struggles, but what encourages you right now as you look across the land?
Yeah, I think one of the things, there's a number of things that I'm really encouraged by. One of the things, I'm not super optimistic about the future of America, in all honesty. That's beyond my pay grade, but my gut is we're moving into kind of decline of the Roman Empire kind of moment. But I'm really hopeful for the future of the church in the West. And, you know, there's an interesting thing in that most of the churches that I would consider some of the healthiest, most robust churches, just thriving, are in Portland, San Francisco, LA, New York, London, like really hard soil. And that isn't to say they're not great churches in, you know, Dallas, Fort Worth, whatever.
Sure.
They absolutely are. But I think that there's something about, as culture becomes more and more secularized and corrosive and hostile toward the way of Jesus, the only kind of life with Jesus that survives that is a really robust apprenticeship to Jesus in community that is orthodox in doctrine, you know?
Yeah.
So it's sad to see cultural Christianity burning up. Like as a father raising 3 kids in a city, and issues of gender and sexuality that frankly are just exhausting to have to like navigate some of these things.
Yeah.
But, and there are times when I just wish we could rewind to like 1950s and A.W. Tozer's greatest problem as a pastor was just people weren't passionate enough or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
But that world is gone.
Yeah.
And it's dead and it's dying. And what I love about this one is it, in a sense, Ron Woolheiser has a more positive view. He's a writer I love, spiritual writer, Catholic. And he has this more positive view of secularism in the way that it purifies and progresses the church. You know, in some ways, like, particularly in issues of social injustice or around race, when you have secular, humanistic people who are actually like doing a better job than you are as a follower of Jesus at calling attention, there's a healthy expose against the church in that. So I think in some ways, secularism both purifies the church, because you won't survive secularism unless if you're really robust in your following of Jesus, and even progresses it, not in the progressive sense, but in the sense that it calls it to what it really believes, you know, whether it be issues of justice or whatever. So I think that if we say yes to Jesus, we can mitigate against the phone and the narrative and the brokenness of sex revolution, said in quotes with sarcasm. I think that what comes out of that is a really thriving, healthy church. Like, there's just no cultural pressure to follow Jesus. The cultural pressure now is all against it. If you're in Tacoma or Portland or wherever. So I love that. And the other thing I'm really encouraged by is the Holy Spirit. And, you know, that the old kind of wars between not wars, but tension, conflict between the charismatic church and the cessationist church. I mean, most people, young people I talk to, don't even know what that is or means anymore. And they're not even aware that it was this major issue for my dad's generation. And they just want more of God. They want to experience God. And they're open to all that God has, and, you know. And there's so little of this pushback that I experience against the things of the Holy Spirit, which just brings life to the church, and life to your discipleship to Jesus, and life to prayer and Scripture.
And if you think of the New Testament church, all of a sudden Jesus has ascended, but he says, I'm going to give you another one just like me. And when he does, they receive the Holy Spirit, but not into any sort of utopia, into immediately hostile situations.
And in some ways, I think, you know, we're getting closer and closer and closer to the world that Paul's writing to in the Corinthians or the Romans or the Ephesians. Like that world of pluralistic, spiritual, pagan, secular, hostile to Jesus, power dynamics, multi-ethnic. That world is more and more becoming. We don't live in that world. It's a pre-Christian world still. But more the cultural, spiritual distance between the Greco-Roman world of the first century and ours at Tacoma is shrinking, which makes the New Testament make more and more and more sense.
I mean, we often talk in our church about we don't need the Holy Spirit for a meeting. We need the Holy Spirit for a mission. And the idea of kind of the old charismatic churches, just we want a fun meeting. The
experience for the experience sake.
And now I think it's more this necessity. Like, I'm feeling overwhelmed with the world I live in. And I feel like I'm really under-equipped to serve and love and see transformation in the world I live in. And then it goes, Jesus said he'd give me another one.
I won't leave you alone.
I won't leave you alone. I'll give you another one just like me. I'll empower you. You'll do the things I did. All these great promises.
And I see that hunger for more of the Spirit on every continent I go to, different streams of churches, different types of churches, you know what I mean? Way outside of just the charismatic church. I see this hunger for more of the Spirit all over. It's great. Know? And that feels to me like a genuine move of the Spirit of God across the Western world.
Which you would call renewal?
Yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah.
Like a sense of just an awakening of, hey, we can't just sit around as business as usual. Things are shifting and changing.
There's no way.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The cultural tide, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Which starts in the church and works its way.
It starts in the morning when you wake up.
Yeah.
I mean, everything starts with personal renewal.
Yeah.
You know, and then it begins in your church, and then the dream is that it spreads from church to church to church and across, and then when it's incredibly beautiful, it does something to culture itself.
That's amazing. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
There's a lot to say, but we so appreciate your voice. So appreciate you being a part of Mobilize this year.
Yeah.
And at your locations, whether you're in Boston, St. Louis, or Tacoma, you're going to now circle up, and your location leaders are going to lead you in a time of dialoguing around some of the stuff that's been said here. Bless you all. Hope Mobilize is a great experience for you.